Hello, good afternoon. Hello, hello, hello. I'm Chibi Morales. I'm Curator of Education at Miami Art Museum, and I'd like to welcome you and also to thank you for coming on a really, truly beautiful Miami afternoon. Our speaker today is David Joselit. Throughout his career as a scholar, critic, and now as Carnegie Professor, History of Art at Yale University, Joselit has addressed pivotal movements in modern art, from Dada in the early 20th century to contemporary currents such as new media and globalization. His lecture today is titled Beyond Repetition, Marcel Duchamp's Readymades, and it was conceived in response to the works of view in Focus, Marcel Duchamp, which is part of the present installation of the permanent collection. And if you haven't seen it, I urge you to do so after the talk, and maybe even go and look at it again after Professor Joselit's talk. Joselit is a long-standing contributor to such journals as Art Forum and Art in America, and he has published a number of books. His first, Infinite Regress, Marcel Duchamp, 1910-1941, was published in 1998 and positioned Duchamp's complex art at the intersection of the waning industrial world and the rise of consumerism. And it also established our speaker as a major voice in discussions about Duchamp. In 2003, he published American Art Since 1945, partly as an outcome of his experience at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Boston, and also of his continuous work as a critic. And then in 2007, he authored Feedback, Television Against Democracy, well, that's a provoking title, which considers television as a closed circuit that artists since the 1960s have broken into in various ways. And in the fall, we'll see the publication of After Art, an attempt to define the present shifting currents in art in terms of the new technology and also globalization. Professor Joselit has been at Yale since 2003, except for spring of 2010 when he was the Kirk Varnado visiting professor at the Institute of Fine Arts in New York City. Previously, he taught at the University of California at Irvine. His counsel is sought on numerous prestigious committees, amongst them CMAP at MoMA, and various editorial boards such as Grey Room at MIT Press and October. And now please welcome our speaker.
Thank you to Chippy for that really very lovely introduction, and it's very nice to be here, and I reiterate that I'm really impressed. Maybe you're used to this beautiful weather, but thank you for coming. I appreciate it. And also thanks to Renee Morales, who made the beautiful exhibition upstairs and is the provocateur of these thoughts. I wanted to start with this image, which perhaps looks self-promoting, but it's really just a function of the fact that Chippy did a good job of publicizing that I turn up in the middle of this Google search, which was just very innocently the other day a Google search of the term or the phrase beyond repetition. And I start with this in order to really underline the fact that what I'm going to try to argue today is that circulation becomes much more important for Marcel Duchamp already in the beginning of the 20th century than the making of objects. In other words, the shape of how images move through the world, how they're reiterated, relocated, talked about, transformed, is actually what the work of art becomes in his view. And that should feel very familiar to us in this moment because, in fact, objects of knowledge and even literal objects are so much the result of the kind of repetitions of search, the patterns of connectivity that we experience every day. I want to argue for a variety of ways in which Duchamp's work uses repetition. The first of which is to really think about how he uses repetition as a kind of revivification. And here I'm using, as a kind of joke, but not so much a joke, an image of Frankenstein, who, after all, was a revivified, remade replication of a human being who became monstrous. We tend to think about repetition as something boring that drains away meaning, but in fact, repetition is one of the most important ways in which meaning is moved from place to place. If I say, I really love that, in a sarcastic way, it means something very different from, I really love that. And this is the sense in which repetition becomes the production of new meanings in the act of actually saying the same thing or citing the same work. So it's a form of revivification. And I want to look at this in Duchamp's career through charting some of the movements, not all of them because they were very extensive, of one of his best-known works known as Fountain from 1917. This is a pretty well-known story, but I'll give you the kind of rudiments of it, the kind of outlines of this episode. Duchamp was part of a jury for an exhibition called the Independence Exhibition in New York in 1917, and it was modeled on similar independent exhibitions that occurred in France, where artists like the Impressionists, who were not part of the official salons, could exhibit independently. And this exhibition was meant to be open to anyone who paid a $1 entry fee and $5 of dues. And it was also meant to be democratically installed in alphabetical order. So it was really a completely open exhibition, they said. But Duchamp proposed under a pseudonym, R. Mutt, which is the signature up here, this urinal, which was basically a urinal he had bought in a plumbing supply company and proposed as a work of art to this jury with the signature, as I mentioned a moment ago. And what happened was that the work was rejected. So there's been debate over whether he knew this would happen or not. That's really not important. What the work does is it outlines or it performs the limit of what can be considered a work of art. In other words, the work here is not so much the urinal, but the category of art, which is delineated by the point beyond which it cannot go. According to this committee, showing a urinal as a work of art is the point beyond which a work of art cannot go. But what I want to propose today is that, in fact, what Duchamp did was he understood the work of art as an idea that was in perpetual circulation, a work that was completely remade over and over again in order to keep it alive. In order to do that, I want to give a sense of what, for him, the ready-made meant, the term he used for works such as this one that were mass-produced, not made by himself, but represented or relocated in a variety of ways. In one of his notes from the early teens, published in 1934, called Specifications for Readymades, he argues that what the ready-made was not a thing, a commodity, but actually an encounter between the artist and a thing, which is very important. It's a connection, not an object. So let me just read briefly this text to give you a sense of the flavor of his writing and also the specifics of how he understood this process working. So as I mentioned, this passage is titled Specifications for Readymades. He says, "For planning for a moment to come on such a day, such a date, such a minute, to inscribe a ready-made. The ready-made can later be looked for with all kinds of delays." So already what's important is the inscription rather than the thing itself. He imagines an inscription without a thing. And then he goes on to say, "The important thing is just this matter of timing, this snapshot effect." Notice the correspondence with cameras. And he goes on, "Like a speech delivered on no matter what occasion, but at such and such an hour, it is a kind of rendezvous." I read this quote at length because it's very important to remember that what the ready-made is a rendezvous. It's a point of contact which might be marked by an inscription. Sometimes it's marked by a relocation, as we'll see. So there are several ways in which this encounter performs different sorts of repetition, and I want to work through these one by one. First of all, there is the repetition of mass production, which has to do with a physical form of industrial production being repeated as an artisanal form of artistic production. In other words, to put it in clear language, a urinal that's made by a company called Mott Iron Works. And here we see from the catalog a similar model. This is the lipped model. If you imagine it without the lip and rotated so that this is here, you see that this is in fact the same form that is in the Mott Iron Works catalog, just as you would see in any catalog today for plumbing supplies or any other mass-produced object. So the first kind of repetition here is the repetition of an industrial object in an artistic context, and it has to do with a physical reorientation. There's a second kind of reorientation that occurs here because the work is called not our Mutt, the name of the artist that Duchamp signs, not our Mott, though it's close to the Mott Iron Works, but it's called our Mutt. And some of you may remember that our Mutt refers to, as Duchamp explicitly states in a text from the mid-50s, to the very popular comic strip Mutt and Jeff, which was begun in 1907 by Bud Fisher and is usually considered the first daily comic strip. So here there's a kind of repetition that's about punning, a linguistic repetition, where Mott becomes Mutt and where something that is industrial becomes something that's comic, something that's regular, that's about a repetition, a dailiness of the newspaper. This is what Duchamp says about this. Mott was too close, so I altered it to Mutt after the daily strip cartoon Mutt and Jeff, which appeared at the time and with which everyone was familiar. So this is also important, that it's a reference to a repetition of a popular cultural illusion which is projected onto the industrial repetition of the plumbing fixture. Thus, from the start, there was an interplay of Mutt, a fat little funny man, and Jeff, a tall thin man. And I added Richard, or in French, Richard, which means in slang, a rich person. So our Mutt, Richard Mutt, would be the kind of money bags Mutt in a certain kind of way. So in the making of this work, or in the staging of this work, I should say, there were two kinds of repetition: the repetition of industrial production and the repetition of punning, which carries with it a kind of repetition of the mass media. Now, it's important to note that in the subsequent life of this object, this is probably the most famous work of art that ever existed without ever being there. Because what happened was that the work, after it was rejected from the Independence exhibition, was actually was brought to Alfred Stieglitz's gallery, which was an important modern art gallery in New York, and photographed. And so we know it largely through this very famous photograph, which is in fact taken, for those of you who are interested in the history of American art, in front of a painting by Marston Hartley, and which shows, it's a little hard to see, it shows the tag. I don't know if you can make that out in the lower left-hand corner. This was the entry tag for the Independence exhibition. So the work was actually photographed, but then lost somewhere lost in the shuffle in either Stieglitz's gallery or in motion thereafter. So there was literally no object anymore, almost instantly, after the object was invented. And this is very important to my argument because, in fact, what we have is a series of representations, of repetitions, but no original. There really is no original because A, the mass-produced object wasn't original, and B, it's gone. So what we have instead is a first encounter, the moment when Duchamp signed the work, Armat, 1917, but we don't have any objective evidence of this except for photographs, texts, etc. So in its subsequent life, the work moved in a variety of other ways. I'm showing you in this slide its earliest publication, the first of very many, which was in an artist's periodical made by friends of Duchamp and people who were in the know about this work and its censorship, called The Blind Man, #2, from May 1917. And there's a text here which I won't quote to you, but it writes about the kind of the Richard Mudd affair, or the Armat affair, where this work was censored from the Independence exhibition. It's a very funny text which includes this title, Buddha of the Bathroom, suggesting, which many art historians have talked about subsequently, that the shape looks almost like a Buddha, another kind of repetition, almost a kind of hyper implausible repetition, but a sort of funny one. My point in showing you this is to argue that what happens is the object disappears, but it re-enters immediately into circulation as both a photograph and then instantly as a text. So it initiates a process whereby the thing is absorbed, is dissolved into informational circulation. And Duchamp sustained this process throughout the entire remainder of his long life. I'm going to show you a few of the instances here. First of all, here is a photograph that is included in the Boxen Valise, a work that is shown, a version of which is shown upstairs in the exhibition, and which I'll talk about more in a moment. And it shows, it's a wonderful photograph that shows Duchamp in a kind of ghostly form here because it was a long exposure. And here is how he installed the urinal in his studio. So on the one hand, it's a kind of insider joke that appears in the artist's studio as, is it a work? Is it a prop? What is it exactly? But then once it has entered history, what happens is it's reinvoked, it's repositioned, it's, to use the term of the category I've put up in this lecture, it's revivified. And I'm sorry, this is a bit of a small photograph, but this is an important early exhibition in the United States of Dada, the movement Dada, which was kind of revived during the 1950s through interest by art dealers like Sidney Janis and also various artists who were very interested in these strategies like Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, Robert Motherwell, etc. What Janis did for Fountain was he was authorized by Duchamp to find another urinal, which in fact, as anyone who's renovated their house recently knows, it's not so easy to find the same plumbing fixtures 40 years later or 35 years later. So in fact, the urinal he found was not the same urinal, but Duchamp invited him or asked him to install it above the doorway with a little piece of mistletoe underneath it, or hanging from it. So luckily, all of you know what that means, and the fact that the urinal would be spilling out, if in fact it were working, onto the embracing couple who might be moving through this doorway. So Duchamp, he did this in a few other instances. I only have this one slide to show you of where he authorized others to relocate or reposition the urinal. And I really think that the reason he does this is that once you see a mass-produced object as a work of art, it's kind of like a one-liner, right? You think, oh, I get it. It's a urinal and it's art. And you might be shocked at first, but then there's no kind of further thought about it. What he does is he uses it as almost a kind of cursor moving through different situations, repeating in the way that we repeat words in very different contexts for very different purposes. Now, a famous way in which he repeated this concept, and which we'll be talking about in some length today, is his box in a valise from, and I use the date 1935 to 1941 because Duchamp put together the 69 different representations of his work that are included in this box over a long period in the 30s and continued to make the work for specific occasions when someone wanted one or when he made so-called deluxe boxes for friends with unique works. Let's not worry about that so much at the moment, but that's why the dating is as it is. So if I've talked about how, on the one hand, the Readymade moves into text in The Blind Man, it moves into a different position in the Sidney Janis instance and others. In this case, what we see is here is a little miniature version of the urinal fountain, which he, does anyone notice that there's something different about it here? It's reoriented again. Here it's in its correct orientation as opposed to the rotated orientation, just to remind you that it was here. So he's even playing with orientation in this work, The Box in a Valise. But here, the kind of reigning concept is about archiving. So that the work belongs not in a reposition in terms of space or an entry into text, but rather its position within his own work as a totality. And I would link this to the question of archives and how objects in the modern world by the mid-20th century and certainly in our time, objects are very difficult to isolate. They belong to groups, to populations of images. And here Duchamp, through this box in a valise, which presents representations of his work in this pop-up way and photographs as well, he is saying no single work exists alone. They exist in a group, in an archive. So that the repetition here has to do with the totality of a career as opposed to spatial or textual dislocations. I want to just point out a few things as we go. I'm going to talk about this work in different ways later on. But here is The Large Glass, the Bride Strip Bear by Her Bachelor's Even, which is his most famous work, perhaps made from 1915 to 1923. I'll tell you more about what that work is about in a few minutes. But for now, just notice that this work was made on glass, and here it's reproduced in clear plastic. Several Readymades put together. This little work you can barely see. It's called Why Not Sneeze, Rose C'est La Vie. It's a little bird cage with sugar cubes made of marble. And he makes it as a pop-out here. So there is a kind of framing of his work in a way that gives a sense of relationships that are both fixed and unfixed, in that they also include a series of reproductions of the work that you can pull out, as you see upstairs in the exhibition, and look at will, almost as though it were a book or portfolio. Now, one very important thing about this work, and another quality of repetition that I want to underline, is that Duchamp took great pains to reproduce all of these different objects from his career. What I'm showing you on the right, the color is coming out not so well, but this is a painting from 1911 called Sonata. It's an early work of Duchamp's. I'm not going to say much about it per se. The reason I'm bringing it in is that it's one of the works that's photographed in the box in a valise. And the way this work was reproduced is extremely complicated and elaborate, and in fact rather old-fashioned at this time. He uses a technique called pochoir printing, which means that every different color area on the photograph is made into a stencil and then hand-colored by Duchamp and others. And what I'm showing you here is a color-corrected photograph that he used to make the reproductions. So why am I showing you this? The reason is that in many of his works, and I don't have time to give you the broad range of examples that would show you other ways in which he did this, so you'll have to take my word that this is not an isolated occurrence. He opened out the space of reproduction, which we think of as instantaneous, right? Especially these days. You take a picture and it's over. It goes from the original to the reproduction instantaneously. What he's doing here is opening up a whole space of elaborate procedures within representation, so that representation is a kind of duration. It takes a long time. It takes many acts. And in fact, the mechanical reproduction is converges with hand painting. So what we have here is a photograph with stencils hand-drawn, mechanically made, and then the colors hand-painted. So reproduction and hand go hand in hand, you'll pardon the pun. The space of repetition is a complex space that is hybrid, composed of the artist's gesture as well as a mechanical process. Finally, and again, I'm even omitting some of the instances where repetition occurs within the life of Fountain. Here is a blueprint for the fourth version of the work from 1964. And what happened here is that Arturo Schwartz, who is a gallerist and a scholar of Duchamp's work, who made a very important catalogue raisonné, or complete catalogue of his work that's still used now, asked him to make a series of editions, in other words, reproductions, three-dimensional reproductions of his early works, his Readymades, including Fountain, which, as I told you, was lost. So how do you make a reproduction of a work that's lost? Well, what they did was they made plans based on a photograph. So it's several layers of attenuation from the object itself. And you can see here that Duchamp has okayed the plans, the blueprints. It says, okay, Marcel Duchamp. So what are we left with here? The important point that I want to make by showing you this sort of early life and subsequent life of Fountain is precisely that what happens with this object, this ready-made, which is often understood as the kind of strongest statement that the work of art is equivalent to a commodity, that Duchamp is just saying, well, a work of art is bought and sold, therefore it's no different from a urinal or anything else that's bought and sold. Instead, I think that's not untrue, but I think what's more interesting and what's more relevant to our present is the fact that this work moves, in fact, from a photograph to a blueprint through various reiterations that I've indicated to you already. In other words, the object disappears into its circulation. The thing is less important than the field of repetitions that it provokes. So I began with a Google array because in a way what I'm trying to argue is that Duchamp was already thinking about shapes of circulation. Now what happens when what I just mentioned occurs, when the object disappears into repetition, is, or at least what occurs in Duchamp's work, is that we get two kinds of spatializations or presentations of circulation, what I'm going to be calling the diagram and the text. And they are represented by two works which importantly have the same title as well as the same subject. The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelor's Even, which is known here as The Large Glass. I alluded to this through its reproduction before from 1915 to 23. And here upstairs, I hope you've had a chance to see this, the same title, but it's known as The Green Box, which was published later by Duchamp. And includes his notes about the large glass, which are slavishly remade. So I want to talk a minute about this question of the diagram versus the text. Both cases are instances where the object is dissolved into a kind of dynamic movement, where things are liquefied, let's say, into motion. Now I could spend an hour, which I will not do, I'm sure you're relieved, talking about the arcane narrative that Duchamp projected on this work. But what I'm going to do instead is give you the one-sentence digest of it. Basically, this work exists in two realms. The bottom part is the bachelor's realm. They look more like mechanical reproduction. These machines move, shake, and rattle below, and this is the bride section above. It's more organic, but it's also an engine, according to him. It has pistons, which are these areas, et cetera, et cetera. Let's not worry about, like, what's the piston in this. For now, let's just imagine, give him the benefit of the doubt. Now, what this work does, what it narrates according to its official storyline, which we know through Duchamp's notes published here, is that it recounts an act of failed consummation. The bride stripped bare by her bachelor's even. What happens is the bride is supposed to generate a kind of sperm-like gas that consummates, the bachelor, his relationship with the bride above, but this never happens. So in fact, this is a narrative of failed consummation between two machine-like realms which are embodied as a male and a female, a bachelor and a bride. Now, I think you'd probably agree with me that it would be very hard to derive that story from this image without a little help, right? I mean, maybe there's a genius on earth who would look at this and say, oh, it's about the bachelors and the brides, and they haven't quite gotten it on, and it's all about failed consummation. We know this only because of the texts which Duchamp provided to us later. But what this work does is it creates a diagram which I would define as a series of vectors of direction, this way, this way, this way, even up in here, and a blossoming. He calls this a blossoming, so it may be to call it a vector is wrong, but it has a kind of directional spilling out, like a stain in a fabric. He provides us with a diagram of motions and movements, which we then have to interpret. So that's one half of what he does after the object dissolves into its circulation. And the other is this attenuation or dissolution of the work into text. And I want to say a few things about this now before moving on. First of all, let me just give you Duchamp himself telling how he made these different sheets of paper that you see upstairs in a multiple. In a 1954 interview, he wrote or said, 12 years after finishing, or rather after putting aside my glass, he called it definitively unfinished, so technically he never finished the large glass that we were looking at a moment ago. I fell upon my working notes, scribbled at random in some 100 scraps of paper. I wanted to reproduce them as exactly as possible, so I had all these thoughts lithographed in the same ink which has been used for the originals. To find paper that was exactly the same, I had to ransack the most unlikely nooks and crannies of Paris. Then we had to cut out 300 copies of each lithograph with the help of zinc patterns that I had cut out on the outlines of the original papers. So in other words, what Duchamp has done is he's taken something that is apparently random, his scribbled notes, and he's gone to great lengths to reproduce them exactly with the same inks and even the little rips you can see upstairs. There are some that are more uneven, like this one. So what he's doing here is he's using repetition as a form of emphasis. Listen to me. Here is a form of repeating that is about giving you the material sense of an original which seems unimportant. It's just a scrap of paper. He could have just done a text. But instead, he makes it into a material ground for this text. And what I take from this is that he thinks about the text of the work, which we usually think of as an interpretation that stands behind the work, right? It's the solution. It's what people like me write about. It's not the work itself. What he's doing is he's saying that the interpretation of the work is itself a work of art, that the text is itself a work, which he takes the care to make or remake exactly, and to circulate in its own way. So what happens then is that there's a disaggregation and a divergence of the diagram, the visual diagram, and the text that occurs. And here, this gives you a sense of how these scraps, sorry, the slide isn't so good, it's a little unclear, but it gives you a sense of how all of these scraps and different papers and even different color inks were very important to him to find exactly. But the disaggregation of the diagram and text actually is a blueprint for what happens precisely in art of the second half of the 20th century, where here I'm just showing two artists, Frank Stella and Joseph Kosuth, as exemplars of much broader occurrences during this period, where painting begins to be understood as a form of diagrammatic, regulated gesture, abstract formulas which are enacted by the artist. There's no particular sense of emotion on the one hand, as in a Jackson Pollock, or a sense of representing mimetically something in the world. What would this be representing? It's called Zambezi, but just because that title is such a disconnect with what the image is, which is basically a set of triangular forms that emanate from the sides of the work into the center to create a kind of cruciform image that's a bit pyramidal and diamond-like. As some of you may know, Stella made his works by using ordinary black paint and hand making the stripes as closely as possible. So there is a kind of unevenness to this that gives a sense of the hand being put through this kind of diagrammatic template. On the other side, we have Joseph Kosuth's early conceptual piece, where he takes a dictionary definition, such as the definition of painting, and blows it up either into a photostat or in some cases a painting itself, and mounts it on the wall as though in the place of a work. So when Duchamp takes the diagram of the large glass and lets it diverge from the green box, which includes texts which are remade as works themselves, which circulate separately from them, it seems to me that he's introducing the DNA of the 20th century events which occur afterwards, where painting begins to be diagrammatic, purely about relational forces, even often when it's figurative, and conceptual art begins to use the text as a work in and of itself. So I see this as an important historical divergence which Duchamp allows us to understand in a different way. Now, if what I'm saying is true, and Duchamp's work demonstrates or performs the dissolution of the object into repetition, into circulation, then how do you make a work of art out of circulation? And I don't mean external to circulation, I mean from circulation, from patterns of circulation. And here's where I want to take a closer look for a few minutes at the marvelous work, or a version of which is upstairs in the galleries, Duchamp's Box and a Valise, which I've already shown you in other representations from 1935 to 1941, but it continues to be developed. So I want to talk about this in terms of how you make a work that shows circulation as a space, how you kind of represent the idea of circulation. And I want to first give you a series of views of the work to give you a sense a little bit of how it works, how it functions, and then I'll make a few proposals about how this happens in it. I like this picture a lot because it gives you a sense of how the work looks when it's spread out, when it's opened up. It is a briefcase when it's closed, or a box, depending on which version. There are deluxe versions, as I'll mention in a moment, which have more elaborate briefcase forms. But it has a screen that comes out, a back and a front, these three-dimensional parts here, and then photographs that can be taken out. So it's very important to remember that this work literally enters into space through deploying a set of repetitions or reproductions. And here, to just back up, here is the work when it is first opened. This is a deluxe case that includes one of the unique works, one of the reproductions of The Bride, which is a painting that is included in reproduction below, a hand-colored reproduction. This is the screen that opens up here. So if we go like that, you get this. And then often we see them like this, where this element is pulled out and this one is pulled out. And here, just back to the image I showed you to begin this discussion. So I want to make 4 points about how this work takes circulation as its object, or thinks about the work of art as a representation of circulation as opposed to the presentation of a thing, of an object. First of all, and I've already mentioned this a moment ago, what the box does is it emphasizes the entire work of the artist as opposed to one individual object. In other words, the thing we are seeing here is not a sculpture or a painting, but the oeuvre, the kind of work in total of an artist. And this is important, I think, because, as I mentioned before, it places the emphasis on an interrelated population or group of images as opposed to any individual image. Secondly, it's very important to remember that the scale here is very strange, that works such as this one, which are quite small, here, let me go back, it's a bit easier to see in this. Now, you've seen from my picture of the photographs I've shown you of the large glass, that the large glass is actually a very large work, and this, the Paris Air piece, which is also upstairs, is actually a very small piece. Moreover, the photographs here that are included are also out of scale. Now, it's often said that this work is like a portable museum, and there's truth to that. It is a little bit like a portable museum in that it opens out with all these different reproductions. But what I would say is that, in fact, it's kind of like the germ of this kind of media circulation as opposed to a spatial museum. Because what happens when things circulate, let's say on the internet or photographically in various ways, is that scale cannot be controlled. That things move from small scale to large scale. You don't know about the original measurements. Things are out of proportion with one another on account of how widely they're spread and what format they adopt, rather than how physically they're sized. And it seems to me that in Duchamp's, in the incoherence of scale that occurs in the box and a valise, what he's suggesting here is that each one of these is a kind of seed of distribution which is out of sync with the physical size of the work, that what matters is its circulation as opposed to its physical status. Third, first being the entire work, second being divergence of scale that has to do with circulation. Third is a logic of storage. This work suggests that an image is either activated or deactivated. It's closed down and put into storage, or it can be opened up and made into something that will address you at any moment. And this has to do, I think, again, with circulation. It has to do with turning off and on the work, putting it away and bringing it out again. This is what the box and valise does. It allows you to store, deactivate, and reactivate, just as he repositions the Readymades in their variety of ways. And finally, the work brings together the idea of a box and a screen. The box is a kind of space for holding things. It could be a room, or it could be a crate, or it could be a briefcase. But the screen here, which opens out, creates a sense of both space and movement from one side of the work to another. It's an architectural and even quasi-media-like form. So I want to end by developing a kind of question about this theme of reproduction or repetition within Duchamp's work by thinking about how it does or does not correspond to biological reproduction. As I mentioned a while ago when I was talking about the large glass, this work is very much about an organic story of a missed connection, of a lack of consummation. In other words, a kind of non-reproductive event where the bride and the bachelor, the conjugal pair, fails to reproduce organically. But what's interesting is that mechanical reproduction is occurring all around, but organic reproduction is halted, is incomplete, is made impossible. Now, this seems to contradict with the fact that the box and a valise, which we've been talking about, is a kind of perpetuation of Duchamp. We could say that what it does is it assures that his children, his works of art, do proliferate. It's a kind of generation, let's say, of a kind of fertility of his own career and of his project. So on the one hand, mechanical reproduction, his thematic of mechanical reproduction always seems to undermine biological reproduction, but on the other, it seems that this is in fact his kind of progeny. There's a complication to this story that I will finish with in order to kind of introduce a paradox, and that is that in these deluxe boxes that I mentioned to you a moment ago, Duchamp made in the mid-40s two works that were particularly organic. I'm showing you this picture just to show you that this work, which I'll present in the next slide again, and the other work that will come with it, would have been found in these deluxe boxes here. This is where the unique work of art would have been presented in those boxes for specific people. And here are the two that I want to draw out of his corpus, literally. The first is Untitled from 1946, and it was for the artist Mata. You may know his surrealist artist, who's a friend of Duchamp's and part of his world in New York and Paris, where he taped together head hair, armpit hair, and pubic hair. And weirdly enough, conservation labs have confirmed this. And even more strangely, this is sort of funny, but this work was tested by the Menil Collection in Houston by actually the FBI science lab, and it was confirmed that this material is in fact seminal fluid. It's called Wayward Landscape, and it was made as the unique object for Duchamp's longtime lover, Maria Martins, who herself is a very interesting figure I can't get into here, but she was a sculptor, the wife of a Brazilian diplomat, and a kind of very cosmopolitan woman with whom he had a long but kind of complicated affair. So obviously this is a very personal work in a variety of ways. But what I want to, the reason I'm showing you this is that both of these works have a strong sense of forms of repetition, the growth of hair, the ejaculation of bodily fluids that are non-reproductive. So it puts a kind of crimp into this question of reproduction or repetition that I've been discussing with regard to Duchamp all along. On the one hand here, he is very interested in what I'd like to call the life of reproduction. In other words, how a mechanical reproduction enters into a whole process and is sustained through the box and the valise and has a duration, as I mentioned, in this very complicated way of using pochoir technique. But on the other hand, the impossibility of reproducing life. So in a kind of pun, I want to end with a question, which is, in Duchamp's work, is the life of reproduction somehow inimical to, contradictory with, the reproduction of life? I mean, it's a paradox that we'll have to wait for its solution, if a solution is possible, for another occasion. So thank you very much. So I guess if you'd like to ask questions, we have some time for that, if there are any. Yes. Well, the question was, why would the bride be with the bachelors instead of a groom? Well, there are a lot of, there's no one answer to that. Duchamp was very interested in the notion of a bachelor, and there has been a kind of discourse around the so-called bachelor machines that emerges from him and has moved through other artists' works. There were famous exhibitions in Paris on the subject, and I think the short answer is that the bachelor becomes a kind of figure of onanism, or to use the more vulgar colloquial term, a kind of masturbatory figure. That the bachelor is someone who's spinning in his wheels, let's say. And literally these mechanisms, I can go back to show you. I like this slide better, even though it's less specific, because it gives a sense of how the work is in glass and how it's a kind of spatial work. But many of these mechanisms that the bachelor is submitted to are circular but not productive. And so I think for him the bachelor has to do with the kind of isolation from consummation, but also this onanistic sort of closed circuit of behavior. Thanks for your question. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. The celibacy issue is definitely, I think this goes back, thank you for these questions, because it helps also, it sheds light on the issue that I ended with, which is this idea that is repetition going to be productive or generative, or is repetition going to be non-generative? We think, our assumptions about repetition tend to fall into two categories. One is repetition drains things of meaning, but the other is that reproduction is about generation, literally. And I think that the celibacy issue is another instance of the kind of non-reproductive expenditure of energy. And you could say it also goes back to this question that really interests me of going around the long way to make something that looks like something else, but going the longest way around about it. So it's really about the kind of space or duration within reproduction that does not generate something outside of itself that he seems to be really interested in. And I think that this has to do with that, both the onanistic and the celibacy issue. I should go to this side. Yes?
In the revolution, you talk about Duchamp's work in relationship to painting, as it was talked about by Dutu, and you say sort of that a psychoanalytic approach is insufficient, but sort of with Autumn believes and the inclusion of these sort of work like repetitious gestures, do you think that in some ways his work does that? So repetition has this sort of psychoanalytic procedure?
The question was, I don't know if everyone could hear, I'm going to shorten it, how do psychoanalytic theories of repetition fit into this this argument, let's say. Sorry, that wasn't the best paraphrase, but I think it got the spirit of the question. I would say and the questioner referred to Freud's theorization of the Fort Da game, which he built up from observing that his grandchild would enjoy throwing away his toy, I think it was a boy, so that his mother would pick it up and bring it back. And Freud decided that, or theorized, that the reason that this was pleasing to the child, even though he was losing his toy, was it was creating a mastery over the loss of his mother by performing it and then taking control of it, let's say. And I do think that that the kind of endless repetition that Duchamp was interested in probably does have to do with some kind of control, and the fact that he is, the fact that he is superimposing an elaborate, expanded form of repetition onto an erotic failure definitely seems to support your argument that there is a kind of deeply psychoanalytic or erotic dynamic coming up here. But that he doesn't, I think he's very interested in the kind of building up these tensions without release, creating these kind of, closed circuits almost. Yes? Was he sterile? No, he actually, I don't think so. He had a daughter which was not very, he didn't really have a relationship with her. He was a ladies' man, but was married only briefly in his youth and then married as an older man. I don't think he was, no. So I don't think that this was biographical, per se. Yes? How many boxes are there? Now that's, Renee, do you know how many boxes there are?
I think there are 320.
There's something like 20 or so deluxe boxes, if I'm remembering correctly, and then, but he made them, as it were, to order. He had the elements, he made the elements in advance and then put them together over a long period of time. And so they weren't all kind of produced at once, but there are a lot. And there's a wonderful book, if you're interested in pursuing this, by a scholar named Eka Bonk, B-O-N-K, who's done a kind of, basically a kind of catalog raisonné of the Boxen of Elise. And it's a wonderful source for finding out all kinds of much more detail and fine-grained information about this work than I was able to give you today. So, there are other questions? Oh, should we do one? So, pardon me? Well, that's a difficult question because the original, I like to call it the initial fountain, I suppose the original, was really lost. So there is the edition of Schwartz. Is it 6, Renee? Schwartz, the 8. Okay. There are editions of 8 of the later ones. Plus, there are, if I'm remembering correctly, there are either 2 or 3 of the reauthorized ones, where, like the Sidney Janis one that I showed you, that where he asked, he allowed other people to find a urinal like that one to re-exhibit it. So they're in various places. There's one in Philadelphia, but the one that we see in the photograph is gone, as far as, unless it's in someone's closet, and will be pulled out. So, okay. Oh, go.
I never thought about what you said with Frank Stella and minimalism. It was a great influence on Stella because of geometric rigidity module that Frank Stella did and so many more did. But he started with this whole repetition, circulation. So. Yeah.
The comment or question was that Duchamp really started something with the Frank Stella comparison. I just want to. I do want to say that I mean, I'm not sure if Stella would root his process directly in Duchamp. What I wanted to really argue was that this divergence of diagram and text really as a work, as opposed to merely an explanation or a subsidiary archival evidence, really, I think we can root to him.
Right.
So thank you. Yeah. Okay, thanks very much. Oh, there's water. Thank you. Yeah, it is.